Hello everyone, and welcome to GeoGuessr Deconstructed. Today we are looking at Mexico. For those who don't know, this is a series where I'm going over every single country that you can find in GeoGuessr, and therefore on Google Maps, and providing general identification and some basic region guessing for it. Mexico is the 14th largest country in the world by area and the 11th most populous. Mexico has 31 states and one separate entity in Mexico City, which is the capital, which is not officially a state. The three largest cities are Mexico City, which can be found in the southern central part here, Tijuana, which is up in the northern bit, right next to San Diego in California, and Leon, which is basically in the middle of Mexico City and Guadalajara up here. The country domain or internet code that you might see is .mx. You see this pretty often. Occasionally you do see some .com and .org, but .mx is pretty common in Mexico. This is the flag of Mexico. It is green, white, and red with an eagle standing on a cactus in the middle. Sometimes if you see it folded up, like against a building or something, you won't see the eagle, so maybe you'll get it confused with the Italian flag, which is the same colors. But generally, there's enough clues and kind of just the general vibe that should let you tell it apart. You do see the flag occasionally, not as much as you would in the US, say, but you do see it every so often. In terms of Google Maps coverage, Mexico is fairly well covered. As you can see, most of the major cities, if not all of the major cities, are fully covered. A lot of the open areas up north are just desert where nobody lives anyways. Mexico is almost all covered in Gen 3 and Gen 4 camera. There is very little Gen 2, about 2%, and next to no Gen 1. If you ever do see Gen 1 in Mexico, it should be in Tijuana, but it's almost guaranteed to be overwritten by now, and most maps don't include Gen 1 coverage anyways. A good resource for looking at what is covered where in terms of camera generations is this website. So as you can see on the right is basically just a set of every time Google took some set of pictures of a certain area in the country. You can filter by date here. So for example, if I want to just see 2007 through 2009 coverage, we have this. In terms of when each camera generation has its coverage, Gen 1 is typically going to be 2007 or so. Gen 2 is roughly 2008, 2009 through 2011. Gen 3 is 2011 through 2019 or so, and Gen 4 is about 2017 to the current day. So for here, if I look at just 2007 coverage, there is a bit around the border. These are actually in Texas. This is just a bit of spillover in how the website determines where a country is. But you can see back here in Tijuana, there is a single dot, which just represents a region. And we can look at, see more dates. We can look at 2007. So this is Gen 1 coverage in Mexico. Though occasionally locations can get mismatched. So this says that there is 2007 coverage. Google also says there's 2007 coverage. So if we go all the way here, this is just Gen 3 coverage, which is just an incorrectly dated location, as it seems. So going back to the big view, the topmost color, which in this case for Mexico is generally purple or blue, is pretty much just going to be the newer dates, as most of the coverage has been overwritten in Gen 4. However, there are some yellows, which on this map specifically should be roughly Gen 2, maybe some Gen 3. The closer red you go, the earlier you get. So if we look down here, we have these like pinkish colors. So the newest coverage on top is going to be Gen 2 here. And if we click basically anywhere else that has purple, the newest generation should be Gen 4, as you can see here. So in case you're ever curious on where you can actually see Gen 2 in the most recent coverage, you can use this map to help you out. Looking at the terrain now, we have some pretty major mountain ranges that dominate a significant part of the country. So most of the Baja Peninsula on the left here, a lot of the western and eastern parts of the country, most of the south central, and down near Guatemala here. The flattest parts are going to be the Yucatan Peninsula, which is up here, as well as the coastal areas in Veracruz, Tabasco, Tamaulipas, and the center in the desert. So for some general identification, the official language of Mexico is Spanish, as you might expect, so you will see Spanish basically everywhere. You'll also see Nahuatl in a lot of place names. This is an Aztec-derived language, and can best be seen in place names such as ones that end in Tepec, or have TL. TL is a pretty good identifier of the language. But typically you will see this just in place names. As far as I know, there's not a lot of writing in the language on buildings or on signs or anything, but you may see it occasionally. There is a bit of car meta in Mexico. So this is the Gen 3 car, and you can see in the back of the car there is a single antenna with a little wire wrapped around it. This can also be found in Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil, but because a lot of the coverage has been overwritten with Gen 4, you'll see this less and less as the years go on. One of the probably best ways to identify Mexico is these octagonal concrete power poles. You do see these occasionally in Colombia as well, but they're a very good identifier for Mexico. They are just octagonal. Even if you don't see all 8 sides, you can see that they have many sides to them, more than just a square or a circle, and they often have text on them. Most of the time, the text isn't super useful. I believe some cases it can be. It can point you towards an area of the country, but generally, if you see this octagonal concrete pole, you'll be in Mexico. This is the bollard of Mexico. It is pretty simple, a cylindrical white with a black bottom, though occasionally you can also see yellow or a red stripe on top. On a lot of Mexican roads, you will see a single yellow line. This is kind of similar to how Canada has single yellow lines. Oftentimes you will see a double yellow line, so just because there's one line doesn't mean you're in Mexico over the US, because likewise the US also uses single yellow lines. It's worth noting that just the yellow lines in general are used pretty often in Mexico, though on some highways you'll see white lines with one yellow and one white outer line, and sometimes you'll see all white lines, which we'll get into later. Similar to US and a majority of Canada, the chevrons in Mexico have a black arrow on a yellow background. Warning signs are also black and yellow. These are the road signs and markers in Mexico. So on the right, we'll have the country road, or like the interstate kind of that you would see in the US. It uses a different shield, kind of similar to the US route shield. Typically it has Mexico on the top and also the number underneath it. The state shield is this more typical shield. Typically has the name of the state or at least an abbreviation on it, though sometimes can be empty and also just has the number underneath it. Occasionally there is also no number. In this case, Cam refers to Campeche, which is in the Yucatan Peninsula. This font here with all of the letters in capitals is the typical one. The one that we just saw in Chihuahua, which was the previous one, looked to be an atypical font. I don't know if that's only in the state of Chihuahua or can be seen elsewhere, but you'll typically see this one all over the country. Mexico is one of a few countries that can be found on GeoGuessr that uses alto on their street signs. You can also see this in Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Panama. Everywhere in South America uses pare on their stop signs, so this is a pretty good tell that you're not in South America. Going back to this sign for a second, one common feature in Mexico across road signs and warning signs is the presence of a more chunky arrow, I would say. So the arrow here is very, very thick in Mexico. Compare this to an American arrow, which is a little bit less so, and kind of just has a general different design to it. A lot of the warning signs are also very, very thick compared to what you would see in the US or Canada. Next, we have street signs within towns. The red and white color scheme here is not really standard, so that being you wouldn't only see red and white street signs in Mexico, but often you do see sometimes the name of the city. This one is not, this is just center zone, and also a postcode, which is designated by the letters C and P, and then a set of numbers afterwards. This is a map of the first 2 digits of the phone codes and where they apply to. Mexico does it kind of strangely in where the lower values correspond to the lower values of state names alphabetically. So because of this, it is kind of hard to learn and probably not worth learning, I would say. So in the previous example, we had the numbers 3, 1 as the beginning. This would correspond to the state of Chihuahua, and in fact, we were in the city of Chihuahua in that example. But because these are not in any geographical order and instead are on an alphabetical basis, being off by one number could result in being off by a factor of the entire country. Such is the case for something like Baja California Sur, which is 23, and Campeche, which is 24. These are very far apart, so if you don't know your postal codes for sure, you can be off by that much distance. Something that you may see occasionally on buildings is this PRI. This refers to the Institutional Revolution Party and is seen pretty often in Mexico. It has the colors of the flag and the letters PRI in it. This is only found in Mexico and is a relatively good indicator that you're there. Some brands that you may see in Mexico include OXXO, which can be found elsewhere but is most typically found in Mexico. and Pemex, which is a gas station that can be found only in Mexico. Finally, in terms of general identification for Mexico, we have the license plates. These use the short style, which is the same as Canada and the United States, and they are learnable to an extent. I am not the biggest fan of having to learn Mexican license plates because a lot of them, especially under the blur, are the same. Also, on this Plunkett guide, I have noticed that a lot of these license plates are actually out of date. So for example, we have the Sinaloa one here, which has a tomato in it. First off, very cool license plate, but is also not the current license plate. This is the current map of all the license plates that can be found in Mexico, and a lot of them are typically just a big bar on top with some text underneath it, and not as identifiable as it may seem, with maybe the exception of the Morelos one here, which is just a huge black bar in the middle of the license plate. And again, much like the United States, cars travel pretty frequently, so even if you do learn license plates, you may see them a little bit out of place for where they should be. So for region guessing, the first thing is a pretty broad range of where it could be, but is based on the style or type of brick used in buildings. So in this case, we have a red brick building. The red brick architecture is typically seen west of Mexico City, though can be found throughout the entire country. But more often than not, it'll be west of Mexico City, such as Jalisco, Michoacan, and Guanajuato. On the other end, we have white brick buildings. Again, these can be seen throughout the entire country, but are typically found east of Mexico City. This includes, but is not limited to, the state of Mexico, Puebla, and Tlaxcala, but again, can be found throughout the entire country, so don't take this as a fact. It is just more common than not in these states and this region of the country. So the first region or states that we are going to look at are Baja California and Baja California Sur, which of course make up the Baja Peninsula. This can be found in the western part of Mexico, right south of California. The best way to identify Baja California is a combination of this type of cactus, which is fairly large and it has a lot of kind of knobbly bits all over, I guess is the best way to put it. It kind of looks ridged all the way around. Baja California is kind of littered with these, so the massive presence of these specific cactus kind of indicates that you're in that region. You'll also see these boojum trees, as they're called, which can be identified by kind of just looking like tentacles. They look very odd, and they kind of just come out of the ground, generally in one branch, but occasionally they do branch out into other ones. And as you can see here, there are just plenty of them, and also plenty of these cacti all around the state. This type of pole is also generally specific to the Baja Peninsula. It is a hanging pole, so we have the wires hanging underneath some crossbars here. It is specifically wooden, as we'll see later in the Yucatan Peninsula. They have a concrete version of this pole. So the wooden version of this hanging pole should put you in Baja California. Finally, for this region, we have the Tijuana Mountains. So as mentioned earlier, there are a ton of mountains in Mexico. The ones outside Tijuana are best characterized by looking fairly sandy, not having a lot of trees on them, kind of rolling hills all around, and being not as large as you may see elsewhere, specifically Monterrey. So now looking at the northern desert states, those being Sonora, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. First off, in western Sonora, typically we have the saguaro cactus, which is basically what you would think of if you think of a cactus, often having this branch, maybe two, that point straight up. You also have this other plant called a fruit cholla. It is a fairly golden plant, and you see it pretty often. There's a bunch of them over here, as well as a lot of cacti. These are also found in Arizona in the United States. Going off of these alone isn't your best bet for guessing Mexico versus the United States, but at the very least, if you guess the wrong country, you should still be pretty close. In Chihuahua, you will typically see a cross on the back of the sign. This is known as the Chihuahua Cross. You do also see a cross on the back of signs like this in the country of Colombia, but these ones typically have a much thicker bar on them, and you should be able to tell it's Mexico based on a lot of other clues. In Coahuila, you typically see these grass tufts on the side of the road. This is probably not the best clue to use for this state, as a lot of other states do have it, but this combined with a general deserty feel, with a lot of sand as well, could put you up there. As just mentioned, Coahuila is also very, very sandy across the entire state, So, looking around, we have just a ton of sand everywhere, even though we're not in the desert in a more general feel sort of way. Moving on to the more eastern states of Nuevo León and Tamaulipas, these are found just south of Texas. The first clue for this region is a bluish sort of pavement. It's kind of hard to see, but if you compare this to some typical pavement or asphalt, you'll see that this one kind of looks a little bit tinged, maybe a bit more blue than typical. This is a pretty good indicator of this region. In this region, you will also find dashed lines on the side of the road more often than not. You do also find this in the state of Zacatecas, which is pretty close by as well, but you do see this fairly often in Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. In comparison to the Tijuana Mountains, these are the Monterey Mountains. They are much more jagged, much larger, less rolling hills. They again don't really have a lot of visible vegetation on them, but in general they're very rocky, very sharp at the top, and kind of just a jagged sort of mountain. Moving over to the western coastal states of Sinaloa and Nayarit, one of the clues for this region is these tar lines on the side of the road line. You also see these in the states of Durango and Guerrero, but they're fairly common in Sinaloa as well. You don't see them on the whole road, but when you do see them, it's a pretty good indicator that you're over here. As mentioned earlier, the Mexico bollard can have a red stripe on top of it. This is actually only found in the state of Nayarit. I believe there's one singular exception outside of it, but say 99.5% of the time, you'll be in the state of Nayarit. The central states in this example, Durango, Zacatecas, and San Luis Potosí, are one of the harder regions as they kind of borrow from the areas around them. So Durango has some desert, the eastern states have more eastern things, and vegetation is pretty hard across all of them as well. One of the more solid clues is the presence of these mud bricks. So these are bricks made of mud and often have just like mud on them. This is found in Durango and some of the surrounding areas, but most typically in this state. Like I mentioned, and will mention later, a lot of cacti can be found in the central states as well. So in this example, we have a lot of prickly pear cacti. In this case, a whole lot of them. Prickly pear cacti generally has more flat petals and occasionally has pink or purple fruit on top of them. Though, to determine the central part of the country versus other parts, you also have this plant. This is known as tree yucca and can be categorized by just being a tree with a very spiky bit on the end of it. Occasionally you can also see things like this one where it has some bends in it as well, but generally seeing these specifically together is a good indicator of the central region, more generally Zacatecas and San Luis Potosí, but can be in just the general center of the country. Onto the southwestern states, those being Jalisco, Michoacan, Colima, and Guerrero. One of the first things in Jalisco is the presence of blue agave. We will see another type of agave that is pretty common later, but compared to this, these are very, very blue. These agave plants are what make tequila, and Jalisco is the main producer of tequila. Another thing with grass, this region often has a lot of long grass. So before in Coahuila, we found a lot of small grass in little bunches on the side of the road. In this region, we have a lot of tall grass, kind of all over, but generally also on the side of the road. As we'll see later on as well, the presence of palm trees, specifically these coconut palm trees, is not indicative of any one region, generally just that you're near the coast. But if you see a large farm or just a big bunch of palm trees like this one, you'll more often than not be in either Colima or Guerrero. But again, take this with more of a grain of salt than you normally would, just because coconut palms are all over the coast of Mexico. The central region just outside Mexico City, which includes the states of Hidalgo, the state of Mexico itself, and Guanajuato, are generally characterized by the presence of this other type of agave called pulque agave. This can be seen in a lot of the country, but is typically in kind of an arc around Mexico City, not including Mexico City itself, just because it's so urban. And while looking like the blue agave that we just saw in Jalisco, is not blue. It does have the same general shape, just a lot of these leaves coming out, kind of looks like an aloe plant as well. But seeing these is a pretty good indicator that you're somewhere near Mexico City, generally north to northeast. You will also see some prickly pear cactus as well in this region, but typically in the regions outside of Mexico City and the state of Mexico. Another power pole, this time this asymmetrical one, that being more insulators on one side than the other one. This one in specific, with this type of insulator, they kind of look like mushrooms. This pole is a good indicator of Mexico City, the state of Mexico, and Hidalgo. Mexico City, being the largest city in North America and also the capital of Mexico, is, as you would expect, very dense, very urban, and very built up. The main meta for Mexico City is the taxis. You have typically the whole top half of the taxi is pink, but in this case it is just the hood. But again, they also say CDMX on them and are pretty obvious once you see them. And again, the city is just so large, you'll see things like skyscrapers and just a lot of people out and about. It's obviously a very big tourist spot. I wouldn't say it looks like New York or something, but it definitely looks like an extremely urban place, which makes sense. Moving on now just east of Mexico City into the states of Puebla and Oaxaca. One of the good indicators for specific region guessing is the presence of these two volcanoes. So they're kind of shrouded by clouds right now, but you can see two distinct shapes here. So one on the left and then one smaller one on the right. These can be found basically between Mexico City and the city of Puebla and are these two volcanoes right here. So being able to region guess based on where you are in relation to those should get you some pretty good points. In Oaxaca, you typically see this type of pavement. There are 3 lines of some cobblestones along with a yellow line in the middle. This can be seen all throughout the state. There are many sources that say this is exclusive to Oaxaca, but in my testing, I was able to find another location that had these 3 strips of cobblestone in Puebla, so it is generally that region, and again, I would say a majority of the time you are in Oaxaca if you see this, but it is not 100% exclusive. Backing out real quick to the state of Puebla, while this isn't really relevant for general pinpointing, it is relevant for state streaking if you ever do that sort of thing in Mexico. The state of Puebla is actually very large and extends much more north than you might expect it to. So all the way up here, up near Poza Rica on the coast, is still the state of Puebla, but it also goes basically south of Mexico City and all to the east of it. So because of this, we have some mountains in Puebla as well, in the north. These are more typical mountains that you may see in Mexico, in just the eastern coast or just in the mountains on the west, but this is still part of Puebla as well. Now looking at the coastal states of Veracruz and Tabasco, again, these are found to the east of Mexico City on that coast, but to the west of the Yucatan Peninsula. Palms are typically seen here, as we can see all around. Again, because we are near the coast, we will see a lot of palms, and these coastal states will have them. This type of palm with more umbrella-looking leaves is more typical of this region, and you'll see these more often in these states compared to other ones, but again, as you are near the coast, palms kind of go everywhere. So you may see these outside of these states, but I believe that these are a pretty good indicator of at least the eastern coastal states as opposed to the western ones. Veracruz is also a very large producer of sugarcane. So this is a giant sugarcane field. Kind of looks like corn if you don't really know the difference, but this type of plant can be seen all over Veracruz, as well as some other places, but Veracruz is the largest producer of sugarcane in Mexico, so more commonly than not, you'll see it here. In the state of Tabasco, you will see sometimes all white road lines. So a lot of the time in Mexico, again, you'll either see a single yellow line, or on highways, sometimes you have a single yellow line on the inside, a white line on the outside, and one in the middle. Here, we have white lines all the way around. This is generally exclusive to the state of Tabasco. Again, you can use other clues such as palms or just the general vibe or sugarcane or stuff like that, but in the most case, all white road lines indicates this state. Now for the state of Chiapas, this is found closest to Guatemala on kind of the southern part of Mexico. One of the indicators for this state or region is just a general graininess to the road and also faded road lines. Chiapas is, I believe, the poorest state in the country, so general infrastructure work on roads is not done as frequently as other states. So Things like road line painting or just general upkeep of the roads is done less often, so you'll see a lot of the more faded road lines. Again, this is not a be-all end-all clue for this state, as other states do have faded road lines, and while it may be more often in Chiapas, it is always good to use other clues if you can. One of these clues is a more tropical feel. So because we are so close to Guatemala, which is a very tropical country, this region of Mexico is very, very tropical, very green, just a general rainforesty vibe almost. It's just a very vegetation-heavy area. We also have banana trees in Chiapas. This can also be found in Tabasco and more rarely in Nayarit on the west coast, but these banana trees are more common in the tropical regions, such as Chiapas and Tabasco in that area, mostly the southern part of Tabasco. But seeing these banana trees, which can be identified by their very broad and relatively long leaves, is a pretty good indicator that you're in this region. The final region that we're looking at is the Yucatan Peninsula. This is off to the east of the country and has the states of Campeche, Yucatan itself, and Quintana Roo. One of the best identifiers for this region is these white or light rock walls that can be seen. These are pretty common in the region. Again, you can see them elsewhere, but at least the lighter rock walls, there are some places that have darker rock walls, but these ones are generally in this peninsula. In the peninsula, you'll also see thatched roofs occasionally. These are just these roofs that are made out of thatch. You can see them as well in eastern San Luis Potosi. It is relatively common there as well as near that coast, near the state as well, but it is fairly common in the peninsula. Occasionally in the peninsula, you can see references to this. This is Chichen Itza and is an old ruin that is in the peninsula. Occasionally, you'll see signs towards it, or in this case, just a reference to it on a sign. This should only be found in the peninsula, as that is where the ruins are located, but because it is a national monument, can be found elsewhere as well. So back to the pole, we have the concrete hanging pole on the peninsula here. It is kind of hard to see the actual insulators, but again, the wires are hanging underneath the crossbars, and this is the concrete version. So the wooden version was back in the Baja Peninsula, which is on the other side of the country, so it is pretty important to know which pole goes where, but at the very least, this is not a desert, and Baja California basically is a desert, so you should be able to identify the two fairly easily otherwise. This one is more of a camera generation thing. In the state of Quintana Roo, which is all the way on the eastern part of the peninsula, the roads are sometimes extremely bright with sand. This is generally only seen on Generation 3 coverage. In this case, I had to go back as the Generation 4 coverage is much less bright, but if you see a very bright road and also Generation 3 coverage and other clues, such as this case, the thatched roof, the general tropical-ish feel, you should be in the state of Quintana Roo. So that is about it for Mexico. In my research, Mexico is one of the harder countries to learn just because a lot of the locations and regions are primarily based on what vegetation grows there. It is definitely difficult knowing where certain types of agave or cactus grow and combining all of those together to pinpoint your location, as there's not a lot of other metas such as power poles. There are very few cases where that's true, but generally pinpointing where you are in Mexico is based on vegetation. So if that's something you're interested in, then I believe it would be a very good country to learn. As Mexico is so large, you can pick up some really good points as to having a good guess rather than just clicking on the capital and hoping for the best. Some next steps to learning the country, as always, learning where major cities are. Learning the state names is a bit more important than maybe somewhere like the US, just because a lot of the state road shields have the state name on them. So knowing instantly where that is should be a pretty good help to at least get you start scanning for the road number. Resources, as always, the Plunkett Guide is a great resource. It goes over pretty much everything I went over today, and of course more, just going into a little bit more depth on some different type of cacti that you may see, some of the more rare ones that put you in a specific state or a part of a state, rather than just general distribution. So the guide that I consulted the most for researching this video is Mexico Deconstructed, name is coincidental only. This guide pretty much has everything the Plunkett Guide. In fact, I think the Plunkett Guide took from this one and goes into even more detail. It is, at this zoom level, 106 pages and goes over pretty much everything. It even has a crash course for learning the most high-value clues. So these are the most common types of vegetation. There are some others, agriculture, as well as full distribution maps of where you can find them. So for example, I mentioned earlier in Jalisco you find the blue agave. This is true. It is also in some of the neighboring regions, but there's also a small pocket in the state of Oaxaca. It also includes the architecture clues. As we can see here, the distribution of red brick is most of the country, but generally west of Mexico City, as well as mountains and soil types in the area as well. This is an extremely in-depth guide, and I highly recommend reading it if you are interested in learning this country anymore, as it goes over basically everything. There's also a very good video that I would like to recommend. It is by Angelo Has Left. It is pretty much just an hour of him playing the AI-generated Mexico map. First off, he's extremely good at the country, but goes very well into detail as to why his picks are where they are, and just generally gets them right on. I think in an hour of gameplay, there was one major mistake, which I would have never gotten anyways. He goes into a lot of the vegetation that he sees in the areas, and what areas have where, as well as some other locations that might have them as well. So this just gives a great insight to someone who's very good at the country playing the game. Phone codes in Mexico are also something that might be worth learning. These are relatively easy to learn compared to postal codes, at least. These are geographically located, not really in an order, but at the very least, the number is more indicative of where the region is. So up in the northwestern corner, including the area that is hidden by my camera right now, up in Tijuana, we have the 6s, then we have the 8s near Texas, going all the way around the country. The 9s are over in the Yucatan Peninsula, Chiapas, and Oaxaca, so on and so on. It's not too bad to learn at least the first digit. Much like Brazil, the first digit at the very least gives you a good region that you're in. And from there, you can probably use other clues to narrow it down even further if you don't want to learn all of the 3-digit phone codes, which, for your own sake, I would recommend against. Again, we have postal codes, and again, I don't recommend learning these unless you are extremely correct with what they are. Maybe at the very least, you can learn the Mexico City ones, which are 0, 1 through 16. But other than that, if you get it wrong and you're off by 1, you could be off by the entire country. So that is it for Mexico. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope I got you just a little bit better at the country. Up next will be Guatemala, so if you're looking forward to that, or for any country, as again, I'm going through all of them, feel free to subscribe, like the video, share it, do whatever you want to get the word out. Thank you again for watching, especially if you've watched this far, and I will see you soon.